The bus dropped her off on the wrong side of the road. Lena Hartwell stepped down onto the gravel shoulder with her duffel bag hanging from one shoulder, and stood there for a moment, watching the bus pull away without slowing. Its rear lights shrank in the cold October evening, swallowed by the distance and the tree line pressing close on both sides of the road, and then it was simply gone. Just silence, and the gravel beneath her feet, and the cold air moving against her face, and the iron gate ahead of her, between two tall stone pillars, overgrown with ivy. She had been on 3 buses today. The first had left at 6 in the morning from a station she had reached on foot, in a town she had stayed in for 11 days, before deciding it was time to move again. The second had been delayed by 40 minutes, and she had sat in a plastic chair during those 40 minutes, watching the glass entrance of the transit station, with the specific, practiced attention she had trained herself to maintain over the past 10 months. The kind that appeared, from the outside, like ordinary patience, and was on the inside, a constant and methodical scan of every face, every vehicle that slowed on the road beyond the glass, every person who looked up from their phone for longer than a few seconds. The third bus had carried her north, through flat countryside, and then rising terrain, and then thick, dark forest, and when the driver announced the stop for the Blackstone Manor Road, she had stood up before the bus had fully slowed. She was tired. Not the sharp, recoverable kind that one good night could fix, but the deep and slow accumulating kind that builds over months of disrupted sleep and sustained watchfulness, and the constant low-level effort of living in a situation that requires you to be always slightly more alert than is comfortable. She had been carrying it for nearly a year, and she had learned to manage it the way you learn to manage a condition that is not going away. By acknowledging it, building around it, refusing to let it be the most important thing in the room. She crossed the gravel shoulder and pushed the gate open. It moved with a low, measured groan. Heavy but well-maintained, the sound of something that had been doing this same movement for a very long time and had not been neglected. She stepped through and let it swing shut behind her, and the latch caught with a clean, solid sound that was, in some way she could not fully explain, a small and real comfort. The path beyond the gate was wide and straight, surfaced with pale, fine gravel that shifted softly under her shoes. On both sides, tall pine trees stood in perfectly measured rows, their trunks dark and straight, their branches reaching inward overhead from both sides, and nearly meeting at the center of the path. A narrow strip of gray October sky was visible above. The air was cold and clean, and smelled of resin, and turned earth, and something that was simply the smell of the north. Old, indifferent, entirely itself. Something small moved in the underbrush to her left, went still, and was not heard from again. Lena kept walking. She had learned, over the past 10 months, that the things worth her attention would make themselves clear without her spending energy on things that were probably nothing. Probably nothing was most things. The useful practice was to keep moving and to keep her breathing even. She had found the job listing 6 days ago on the community board, inside a shelter in a town she had passed through without intending to stay in. One sheet of white paper, plain black text, a staffing agency name, a phone number, and the words, live-in domestic staff position, private residence, Northern Territory, meals included, full discretion required. She had read it twice, standing in the corridor with her jacket still on, and then, without letting herself think about it too carefully, she had torn the phone number from the bottom of the page and put it in her jacket pocket. Thinking carefully about available options had become a reliable way of finding reasons not to take them. She called in the morning from the shared phone near the shelter's front desk. The woman on the other end was brisk and professional, her questions practical and specific. Could Lena maintain a household to a high standard, cook basic meals, follow a structured schedule without supervision, maintain complete discretion? Yes to all of it, without hesitation. She had done domestic work before, not under her real name, but she had done it well, methodical, quiet, thorough. The kind of worker who completed tasks without needing to be checked on. Were there references? She explained carefully that her most recent employer had relocated internationally and was not reachable by telephone, but that written character letters were available on request. A short pause on the line, just long enough to mean something, and then the woman said the position was available in the Northern Territory. Placement could begin Thursday. Could she manage that? Lena had said yes before the woman finished asking. She wrote down the address and did not ask who the residence belonged to, because she had been afraid that asking too many questions would tip the opportunity out of her hands before it settled properly into them. She had the address. She had the start date. That was the whole of what she needed to hold on to. She found out on the bus. The woman seated beside her on the long northern route had been pleasant and quiet, and near the end of the journey had glanced at the address on Lena's notepad and gone briefly, noticeably still. Then she said it, in the careful tone of someone conveying something they consider important. Blackstone Manor. And then, because the name apparently left a gap of context, Dominic Blackstone, the alpha of the Blackstone pack. She said his name the way you say the name of something that is both powerful and serious, as a fact that assumed the listener already knew why it mattered. Lena had nodded like she already knew this, and turned her face back to the window. She understood what those words meant. She had grown up near pack territory. She had spent 3 years living inside a pack's formal structure. She understood what an alpha's title meant, in terms of authority and hierarchy, and the specific weight that the title carried in every room the person entered. She was not naive about what she was walking toward. She had spent the remaining hour of the journey pressing against one specific fact. Dominic Blackstone was not Gerald Voss. She did not know whether this particular man was kind or cold or something between the two. She did not know what kind of person he was in the private, unobserved moments of his life. But he was not Gerald Voss, and she held on to this with the quiet, deliberate grip of someone who has found the one solid thing in an uncertain situation, and has decided it will be enough to carry her from here to there. The manor appeared as the pine corridor opened into a wide stone forecourt. 3 stories of dark stone, broad-faced and solid, a front door beneath a carved arch, tall windows evenly spaced across each floor. The grounds on either side were maintained with precise and unsentimental care. Hedges cut straight and even, paths edged cleanly. Nothing decorative that did not serve a clear purpose. No softening at the edges, just the house and its grounds in their severe, functional order, telling plainly what they were, and not attempting to be anything else. Lena stood at the edge of the forecourt for a moment. She had spent enough time in places that tried hard to appear welcoming to understand that this one was not trying. She had also learned that the ones that tried hardest were often the coldest in practice. This house was telling her plainly what it was. She could work with plain. She crossed the forecourt and knocked. Clara opened the door in under 10 seconds. She was in her mid-50s, compact and silver-haired, with a back that was absolutely straight, and dark eyes that completed assessments quickly and accurately. She looked Lena over once. Bag, shoes, face. The efficiency of a woman who had been doing this for a very long time. "You're on time," Clara said. "Yes. Thank you for the position." A fractional shift in Clara's expression. That was not warmth, but was not its absence either. She stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside. We'll see about thank you." The entry hall was large and very quiet. Pale stone floors reflected the gray evening light. A staircase curved up from the left in dark, polished wood. 3 paintings on the right wall in subdued greens and grays, chosen for how they filled a space correctly, rather than for what they said. A long corridor running ahead and disappearing around a turn. Everything exactly placed, and the silence with a particular deliberate quality to it. Clara led her through the working areas of the house in a thorough and orderly tour. The main kitchen and adjacent staff kitchen, both warm and well organized. The laundry room with its precisely labeled shelves. The linen storage room in the east corridor. The supply rooms. The east corridor itself, dim and cool and quiet. Then through the door at the back of the main corridor into the staff wing, which had lower ceilings and simpler walls but was clean and warm, and properly maintained. The room at the end of a short hallway was small and exactly sufficient. A single bed with white linens, a dresser with 4 drawers, a desk and a chair near the window, a window looking out onto the back garden and its stone walls. 2 uniforms hung on the hook behind the door, dark gray with white collars, pressed and waiting. Lena set her bag down on the bed. She stood still for a moment. Just a moment. She let herself feel, carefully and in small measure, the specific quality of what it meant to be in a room, with a door that locked and walls on all 4 sides, and a window facing a gate. She felt it, filed it, breathed it out, and turned back to Clara. The briefing covered every relevant rule in careful sequence. No entry to the East Wing after 9 in the evening without a summons. No entry to the Alpha's private quarters at any time without prior authorization from Clara or from Owen, the beta and household's secondary authority. Uniforms during all working hours. Phones on silent, no guests. Complete confidentiality about the household. Work concerns to Clara. Security matters to Owen. Lena listened, committed everything to memory, and asked one question. If she urgently needed something from the East Corridor supply room after 9, what was the correct procedure? Clara looked at her with what functioned, in the economy of her expressions, as approval. Restock before 8:30, she said. If something is genuinely urgent, come to me and I will handle it. You do not go into the East Corridor after 9 on your own. Understood, Lena said. She met Nina before the afternoon was over. Nina was 19 or 20, with dark curly hair pinned back on duty, and a face that expressed things easily and quickly, open in the particular way of someone who had decided to be generous with people, until specifically given a reason not to be. She talked while she showed Lena the household systems, with the easy, comfortable manner of someone who assumed the friendship was already established and was simply catching the new person up on the practical details. Beth was the third member of the household staff, older and quieter, precise and efficient, a woman of carefully measured words, who communicated mainly by what she chose to include. She gave Lena a nod of greeting that was brief and direct, and contained exactly the right information in it. I see you. I have no objection. Let us do good work together. It was Nina who pulled her aside near the linen closet late that first afternoon, speaking quickly and low, with the manner of someone who has information that is genuinely useful and limited time to give it. He was not a bad man. She said this first, clearly. He was fair and consistent, and didn't treat the staff badly, and working here was calmer and more stable than most places she had been before. But 3 years ago, someone important to him had been lost. Nobody in the house discussed it directly. The details were private. What was visible to anyone paying attention was the shape the loss had left in the household. Controlled, quiet, precise. Everything running around a grief that nobody named, but that everyone moved carefully around. We don't disturb it, Nina said. We work well, and give him the space he's built for himself. That's the arrangement, and it works. I understand that kind of arrangement, Lena said. Nina looked at her with a directness that was a little surprising in someone her age. The East Corridor, after 9, she added. Take that rule completely seriously. That's when he walks when he can't sleep. Running into him in those hours is a lot, for everyone. I won't be there, Lena said, and meant it entirely. She completed her first evening's tasks with the methodical care she brought to everything that mattered. The dining room table polished to a clean reflection. Guest bathrooms on the second floor restocked and straightened. Entry hall swept. Main corridor tidied. Each task done fully before the next began. Everything returned precisely to its place. She ate dinner in the staff kitchen with Nina and Beth. Warm food, genuinely good, roasted chicken and root vegetables and bread. She ate all of it. Nina talked about small, pleasant things. Beth contributed 2 precise and useful comments. Lena listened and participated, and found that the tight band of tension across her shoulder blades had, by the end of the meal, eased slightly, in a way she noticed, specifically, because it had been a very long time since she had felt its absence. She went to her room, changed, set her alarm for 6, and lay down on the bed. She stared at the ceiling. The house settled around her in the quiet language of old stone and cold weather, those small structural sounds of beams and pipes, and the deep, unhurried shifts of a building that had been in the same position for a very long time. Outside, through her window, the rectangle of sky above the garden wall was fully dark now, starred faintly in the gaps between thin clouds. The pines moved at the far boundary. She ran her nightly inventory. Behind walls and a locked gate, nothing dangerous disclosed. No trail she was currently aware of. The agency had the name she used, and that name had its own history of not appearing in certain records. She was, to the best of her current assessment, in a location she had not been followed to. For now, she was safe. She said this to herself with the practiced steadiness of someone who had said it every night for 10 months, in different rooms in different towns, and had kept having to find a new room to say it in. For now was all she had ever honestly been able to claim. For now was also the whole of what tonight required. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep quickly, but she stayed still. She kept her breathing even. She let the quiet of the small room settle around her. Above her, in the north end of the third floor, a light stayed on past midnight. A man sat at a desk in the room beyond it, working through correspondence and reports with the focused intensity of someone who had decided, over 3 years, that filling the hours was the nearest available substitute for rest. Lena did not know this. She was looking at the ceiling, counting her breaths. But if she had looked at the glass in her window and seen the pale reflection of that distant light against the garden wall outside, she might have wondered about it. She might have understood, in the specific quiet way she understood things that other people missed, what kept a person at a desk long after the house had gone silent. She would have recognized it. She would have understood it better than she wanted to. Dominic Blackstone woke at 5 in the morning, as he had every day for the past 3 years. Not because of an alarm. He had stopped using one not long after Diane died, when his body had quietly reorganized itself around the new shape of his life, and decided, on its own authority, that 5 o'clock was the point past which sleep was no longer a reasonable expectation. He had not fought this. He had looked at it practically and built his mornings around it, which meant that by the time the rest of the household came to life, he had already reviewed the overnight correspondence, checked the pack's nightly security log, and addressed whatever small immediate matters the previous day had left unfinished. This morning the security log noted a vehicle that had stopped on the southern boundary road for 11 minutes in the early hours before driving on. He assessed it as probably nothing, a lost driver consulting navigation, and made a note to confirm this with Caleb at the afternoon check-in. Then he turned to the correspondence. He stood at the study window with his coffee, while the files loaded. The grounds below were gray and still. Morning mist lay low against the lawn, white and slow-moving, gathered in the angles where the garden walls met, and drifting in thin, unhurried currents toward the tree line at the far end of the property. The sky was the specific pale gray of early October that had not yet decided what kind of day it intended to be. No wind. The pines at the property's boundary were completely still. These early mornings were the only part of the day that had no shape imposed on it from outside. Between 5 and 7, before the structure of the day assembled itself around the requirements of the pack and the territory and the estate, there was this, just the mist, and the quiet, and the light arriving slowly across the grounds, and no one asking anything of him yet. He had come to value this window with the specific appreciation of a man who had understood, too late, that undemanded time was a thing to notice and not take for granted. He turned from the window and went back to his desk. Owen arrived at 8:30, as he did every weekday morning. 2 knocks on the study door. A pause. Dominic's word. The door opened. 11 years of this sequence, and Owen had never varied it by a single step, never come through without knocking, never assumed that the access Dominic had given him over the years excused him from the small ritual of asking for it. Dominic had come to understand, as the years made it very clear, how much he relied on this. Owen settled in the chair across the desk and went through the week's schedule with the organized thoroughness that made him good at what he did. The conference call with the Aldridge and Callaway packs about the shared boundary road repairs. The meeting with the estate manager about the winter maintenance program. The council review on Friday afternoon. The territory boundary map update that had been requested 3 weeks ago and remained unfinished. At the natural pause at the end of the agenda, Owen sat back in his chair, in the specific way he sat back when he had something else to say. "Say it," Dominic said. Owen's expression moved through a brief, careful negotiation with itself. The Aldridge pack followed up again, their alpha's daughter. The introduction they've proposed twice. They sent another message through the council line yesterday. Tell them thank you, and no. Dominic. Thank them and tell them no, Owen. Owen was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone who has chosen their words before committing them. When he spoke, his voice was measured and direct. Nobody is asking you to replace something that can't be replaced. I want to be clear about that, because I think sometimes it sounds like that's what they're asking, and it isn't. What the pack is asking for is a signal, something that says the future exists as more than just maintenance, that you're present in it, the way an alpha needs to be present. He met Dominic's eyes. 3 years of running on function alone is a long time. Dominic looked at the territory map on the far wall. He had spent 11 years building this territory into something solid and reliable and protective of its people. He knew every boundary and every patrol route and every name of every person with authority within it. He was excellent at running it, He had always been excellent at running it, and the past 3 years had produced no evidence that this had changed. "The pack is stable," he said. "The borders are secure. The territory is healthy." "Yes," Owen said, very quietly. "And those are not all the things a pack needs from its alpha. And you know that." The study was quiet. Outside, one of the groundsmen had arrived, and was working along the far hedge with clippers, moving in patient, even strokes from left to right. "No introductions," Dominic said. "Not now." Owen accepted this with the acceptance of a man who knows an immovable decision when he meets one, and also knows that not all immovable decisions stay that way. He picked up his notebook, and they moved to the next item. The rest of the morning was the work. The conference call with the 2 neighboring alphas about the shared road ran for 3/4 of an hour, and ended in the usual way. Each party took on slightly more than they had wanted, and slightly less than they had hoped to gain, and all 3 men called this equitable, and ended the call. Dominic had long since made his peace with interpack negotiations as a necessary and recurring feature of running a territory with neighbors. The estate managers' meeting covered the winter maintenance schedule in specific and practical terms, heating systems across the full property, a section of the west wing roof that had shown weathering and needed work before the first hard frost, the scheduling of outside contractors for tasks that exceeded the household's own capacity. He listened, decided what required his direct input, and delegated the rest to Owen and Clara. Caleb's security update in the afternoon confirmed that the Boundary Road vehicle was a delivery driver who had stopped to consult his map, nothing requiring action. Dominic moved through the house between meetings at the measured, deliberate pace that had become his natural register over the years. Not slow, not hurried, the pace of someone who had decided that efficiency did not require rushing, and that a steady, unhurried manner communicated its own kind of authority. He was 3 days into the new staff member's placement when he became aware of something. He registered it the way he registered most low-priority changes in the composition of his territory, below the level of conscious thought, as a background alteration that was noted and filed without demanding attention. A new scent in certain corridors, light, clean, different from the familiar household composition, present in the east corridor in the morning, on the second-floor landing in the afternoon, near the kitchen corridor once, briefly. He noted the connection to the new placement, and moved on, without attaching further significance to it. The third afternoon, he was working through legal documents about a boundary matter in the library, when footsteps passed in the corridor outside the closed door. He looked up without fully intending to. They were quiet, in a specific way, that was not the natural quiet of someone at ease in familiar surroundings, but the practiced quiet of someone who had trained themselves to move without disturbing anything. There was intention in the lightness of each step, a deliberateness that was almost invisible, precisely because it was so consistent. He looked at the closed door. The footsteps continued past, without pausing, and faded down the corridor toward the east wing. He looked back at the documents. He read the same paragraph 3 times before it connected with anything his mind was actually doing. Then he went back to the start of the section and read it properly. He ate dinner alone that evening, as he always did. The tray on the corner of the desk, the meal eaten without tasting it in any particular way. The tray cleared half an hour later. He worked until 11. He went to bed and lay in the dark. His wolf was quiet. It had been quiet for 3 years, in the specific way of something from which the essential animating force has been removed. Not the restful quiet of ordinary sleep, not the comfortable quiet of a thing at peace, but the quiet of absence. The way a room sounds when something that was producing a sound is gone, and you did not realize there had been a sound until there was no longer one. He had built his life around this quiet, so thoroughly that he no longer examined it much, simply moved through the structure he had built, and maintained what needed maintaining, and carried what had to be carried. He closed his eyes. He ran through tomorrow's schedule in the methodical way he used to move himself toward sleep, emptying the day of its accumulated weight, one item at a time, until there was nothing left to hold him in the waking hours. Outside, the pines moved faintly, in a wind too slight to hear. Deep inside the hollow place in him, something shifted, too small to name, too slight to identify as anything in particular, just a change in the quality of the silence, the way air pressure shifts when a window is opened in another room, and you feel the change before you hear any sound. The faintest possible suggestion of something different arriving at the very edge of awareness. He did not notice it. He was already moving towards sleep. He slept. He had built his days around the silence so effectively that most mornings he woke with a clean, functional mind and a full schedule, and moved through both with the precision of someone who had decided that precision was enough. And on most days he was right. The pack was stable. The territory was healthy. The borders were secure. These were real things, substantial things, things he had built with years of careful and consistent effort, and he did not diminish them by acknowledging that they were also the only things he could fully rely on. What he could not rely on, could not plan for or predict, was the particular quality of the nights. The nights were different. The nights had a texture to them that the days did not, because the days were full of things requiring his attention, and the nights were full only of what was left after the things requiring attention had been dealt with. What was left, 3 years into this life, was the hollow quiet, the space where the wolf's voice had been. He had gotten very good at not thinking about it directly. He had not gotten quite as good at not feeling it. Some nights were simply quiet. He lay in the dark, and his mind ran through the remaining tasks of tomorrow, and he slid eventually into a few hours of sleep that were not restful, but were functional. Other nights the quiet had a quality to it that he could not organize or fill with work, a specific texture that made the hours slow, and the ceiling very near, and the house around him feel large, in a way he had not permitted himself to notice during the daylight. On those nights he walked the east corridor. He walked it because movement helped in the way that work did not always help, because the particular quality of that specific corridor in the dark had become, over time, a strange and reliable constant. The amber light at the base of the walls, the closed doors on either side, the smell of linen and wood polish and the old stone beneath both. He walked it, and he breathed, and he let the hours pass, and eventually, he went back to bed, and eventually, the morning came. He had been doing this for 3 years. It worked, he told himself, on the mornings after the walking nights, that working was enough, that function was enough, that a pack led well, and a territory kept whole, and a household run with precision, was a life of real and genuine substance. On those mornings, he almost always believed it. Owen did not push the introduction conversation again that week. He had the wisdom, earned through 11 years of working beside Dominic, to know the difference between a door that would open if he leaned on it, and one that was a wall. He worked around the wall, as he always did. He kept the schedule. He managed the logistics. He brought the things that needed to be brought to Dominic's attention and took away the things that could be handled without it. On Thursday afternoon, Owen found Dominic standing in the doorway of the study, looking at nothing in particular, which was unusual enough that he paused in the corridor and looked at him for a moment. "I'm going to ask something," Owen said. "You always are," Dominic said. "When did you last do something that wasn't work?" Dominic looked at him. "I ran this morning." "I mean something that wasn't running or work." Dominic thought about it. He thought about it for longer than the question should have required, which was itself the answer. Owen said nothing further. He went back to the estate office. He had made his point. Dominic went back to his desk. He worked for another 2 hours, and then he stopped working, and sat at his desk without working, and looked at the territory map on the far wall. He looked at it for a long time, not because it required looking at, but because looking at it was something to do, that was not work, and was also not thinking about the specific quality of the silence that had been his companion for 3 years. Then he picked up his pen and went back to the correspondence. The household moved around him, as it always did. Clara supervised the staff. The staff completed their tasks. The meals were prepared, and the rooms were cleaned, and the grounds were maintained. Everything in the house functioned with the quiet, reliable precision that he had organized it to function with, and it was, by any measure, running well. By the end of the first week with the new staff member, the new scent in the corridors had become unremarkable. Background. Part of the composition of the household. He registered it with the same automatic, unattached awareness with which he registered everything in his territory, which was to say he registered it, and immediately moved on. He told himself this. He believed most of it. It happened on a Tuesday evening, and Dominic had not intended to be in the East Corridor at that hour at all. He had gone for a run. This was the unusual part. He ran in the mornings. It had been part of his daily structure for years, a physical discipline and a practical necessity, one of the reliable anchors of his routine. He did not run in the evenings. Evenings were for work, for the accumulated items of the day and the preparation for the morning, and he had organized his time precisely enough that the evenings were always full. But this particular Tuesday had a quality he could not name with precision. He had sat at his desk at 5:30 with the document he needed to review open on the screen, and the concentration he normally relied on was simply not available, not impaired by anything specific, not troubled by anything he could identify, simply absent, like a tool that has been set down somewhere and cannot be found when you reach for it. He had read the same section of the document 3 times, and each time the words passed through his eyes without touching his actual thinking. He was restless. He identified this with precision and without pleasure, because restlessness was not a condition he permitted himself frequently. It was inefficient and unproductive, and in his experience produced nothing useful. But it was there, sitting in him, with the stubborn quality of something that intended to stay until it got what it needed, and the document on the screen was not what it needed. He put the document down. He went for a run. He went north along the inside of the boundary fence, following it east as the ridge rose and the tree line thinned and the sky opened above him. He moved hard from the start, not building gradually, but going at pace from the first step, because whatever the restlessness was, it responded to effort in a way it had not responded to sitting at his desk. The cold air came sharp and clean. His lungs worked. His legs found the rhythm of the uneven ridge terrain. His wolf ran with him. This was always true during physical movement. His wolf was more present then than at any other time, closer to the surface, synchronized with him in the specific way that running produced. Present, but still quiet, still not speaking, still carrying the hollow silence of 3 years. He ran north along the ridge, east for another stretch, then curved south and back toward the manor. He pushed hard on the return, harder than the run required, because the physical effort was the only available outlet for whatever was in him this evening, and he intended to use it. By the time the manor's lights appeared through the trees, his breathing was significant, and his legs were genuinely tired. He came back through the east side of the grounds, because it was the shortest route from the ridge to the side entrance. The temperature had dropped sharply in the past hour. He was colder than the length of the run would normally leave him. His mind was in the loose, unfocused state that follows hard physical effort, everything slightly softer and less defined than usual. He came in through the side door and entered the east corridor. The corridor was dim. The amber nightlights at the base of the walls were the only illumination, the overhead lights off. Clara's rule about the east corridor was clear, and he knew it. After 9, the corridor was to be clear of staff. It was not 9. He had come back earlier than he would have on an ordinary evening. He was not thinking about the rule. He was moving through his own house, in the post-run state of mind, heading for the staircase, not particularly focused on anything. He walked past the linen storage room. He stopped. He went back. He pushed the door open, in the automatic, unconsidered way of a man moving through familiar territory, with a specific practical thought that had surfaced without his fully registering it, because he had thought he left something in the storage room earlier in the week. The light inside was on. Lena was standing with her back to him. She had worked a split shift that day. Clara had mentioned this at the morning briefing, a practical scheduling note that Dominic had registered and moved past, without attaching any significance to it. She was in the process of changing out of her work uniform. Her work blouse was folded over the edge of the shelving unit beside her. She was pulling her own regular shirt over her head, and her back was to the door, and he could see the long, straight line of her back, the curve of her shoulder blades, the back of her neck below the fall of her dark hair. She had not heard the door open. He stood in that doorway for 2 seconds. He was completely still, not paused, not processing. Completely, entirely still, in the way of a body that has received something so powerful that the ordinary chain of decision and motion has been overridden before the mind has had any part in it. His hand was on the doorframe, his body had stopped itself, and his mind was not yet involved. Then it happened. There is no language that is fully adequate to what happened in those 2 seconds. He tried, afterward, to find language for it, because he was a man who dealt in precise language, and he needed to be able to name this accurately, in the privacy of his own thinking. The closest he came was this: something opened, Something that had been completely closed for 3 years. Closed so thoroughly and for so long that he had stopped thinking of it as a closed thing, had simply incorporated its closedness into the structure of his life as a fixed condition. Opened. Not gradually. Not with preparation or warning. With the absolute completeness of something blown fully open by a force that makes the architecture of it briefly, utterly irrelevant. Through the opening, his wolf rose. Not the subdued, background presence of 3 years of dormancy. Not the mild, suppressed aliveness it achieved during a run. Completely, entirely, all the way up. Awake in the way of a thing that has been dark for a very long time, and is suddenly burning at its full designed capacity. And his wolf said one word. Mine. It arrived from somewhere below thought, below decision, below all the layers of discipline and governance, and careful construction he had built himself into over 11 years of being an alpha. It came with a certainty so complete that certainty is almost the wrong word for it, because certainty implies that doubt was possible and was overcome. There was no overcoming here. There was simply a fact being registered, the way a compass finds north. Not by deciding north is the direction, but because north is where it has always been built to point, and it has found it. Mine. Dominic pulled the door shut. He moved quickly and quietly, the door fully closed before she could have heard it, before she could have turned around. Then he was standing in the amber-lit east corridor, with the closed door at his back, and his hand still on the door handle, and his heart was doing something it had not done since he was a young man, hammering, actually hammering, against the inside of his chest, with a force he felt in his throat, and at the tips of his fingers. He released the handle. He pressed his back against the wall on the other side of the corridor. He stood there, and did not move. His wolf was not quiet now. His wolf was fully awake, and it was saying mine, with the steady, unhurried certainty of something that has found what it was always built to find, and is resting in the knowledge of it. Not urgently, not loudly, with the deep, patient calm of something that has been oriented toward one direction its entire existence, and has now, finally, after 3 long years of nothing, found that direction. He told himself, using the full force of his intelligence and his years of governing himself and his pack, that this was not possible, that fated bonds did not work this way, that a wolf that had lost its mate did not find another, that everything he had organized his life around for 3 years was based on a truth about what was available to him, and one moment in a doorway did not overturn settled truth. His wolf said mine again, quietly, with no interest in the argument at all. He pushed himself off the wall. He walked down the east corridor, with his pace measured and even, because measured and even was what he did, because he had built this into himself over 11 years as a structural response to pressure, and he was using it now, even though everything inside him was doing something that bore no resemblance whatsoever to measured or even. He went upstairs to his study. He sat behind his desk in the near dark without turning on the lamp. He sat with his hands flat on the desktop and his wolf fully awake and speaking, and his mind running at speed through everything he had believed for 3 years about his own life. After a long time, he turned on the lamp. He picked up the document he had not been able to read before the run. He read the same section 5 times. By the 5th time, something in it connected. He worked until 1 in the morning. He went to bed and lay in the dark, and his wolf was awake, and the hollow place in him was not hollow, and he told himself, with deliberate care and full conviction, that he was not going to act on any of this. His wolf waited. It did not argue. It simply waited, in the specific patient way of something that has found what it was looking for and understands, at a level far below the reach of argument, that the finding will not be undone by any amount of reasoning. Dominic lay awake in the dark for a very long time. The morning came eventually, as mornings always did, and it found him at his desk at 5 o'clock exactly as usual, with the security log open, and the overnight correspondence ready, and the first pale light arriving across the grounds outside his window. He looked at the grounds below, and at the mist sitting low against the lawn, and at the dark line of the pines at the far boundary, and he breathed, and he told himself that last night was something he was going to deal with rationally. He was good at dealing with things rationally. He had spent 3 years demonstrating this. There was not a single person in his pack, or his territory, or his acquaintance, who would have looked at him and suggested that rational, systematic, precise management of a situation was not his primary strength. He applied this strength now. He went through the event with the same analytical method he used for everything that needed analysis. What had happened, the specific conditions under which it had happened, the state he had been in, the documented characteristics of extended dormancy wolves, which he had read about extensively in the months after Diane died, when he was trying to build an accurate framework for what his life had become. The known tendency of dormant wolves to produce anomalous responses to stimuli that a wolf in ordinary functioning state would process without confusion. False resonance. That was the clinical term for it. A dormancy-induced overreaction. His wolf had been silent for 3 years, had been running at a fraction of its ordinary alertness, had been starved of the kind of connection that it was built to have, and when it encountered something that triggered any part of that connection, even coincidentally, even without actual significance, it had overreacted in exactly the way that documented cases predicted. This was the rational explanation. It was parsimonious. It was consistent with the evidence. It required no impossible conclusions about second chances, or fated bonds, or any of the things his wolf appeared to believe very firmly. By 7 in the morning, he was satisfied with this. By 9, he was somewhat less satisfied. By noon, the satisfaction was almost entirely gone. The problem, as he had told himself it would not be, was practical and immediate, and not amenable to rational analysis. He was aware of where she was in the house. Specifically, distinctly, continuously aware. Not in the background ambient way, he was aware of all movements within his territory, in a pointed and particular way that his wolf apparently considered important, and that the rational part of his mind was failing to outweigh. He knew when she was in the kitchen. He noted when her footsteps passed his study door. He was aware, at 2:30 in the afternoon, that she was somewhere in the east wing, and he became aware of this before any sound or scent could have consciously reached him. His wolf was not confused. This was the thing that undermined the false resonance theory most effectively. The false resonance theory required his wolf to be confused, required the recognition he had felt in the corridor to be an error, a misfire, a product of the dormancy's effect on the wolf's calibration. But his wolf, right now, was the clearest and most certain thing in him. It was not the confused, grasping response of something acting on insufficient signal. It was the absolute, settled recognition of something that has found what it has always been oriented toward. Dominic put his pen down. He looked at the window. He picked his pen back up and went back to work. He was going to carry this. He was entirely capable of carrying a thing he had decided not to act on. He had carried harder things than this, and he had carried them well, and he would carry this one too. He thought about this on Thursday afternoon, when Owen left the study early, and he was alone in it. He thought about it with the honest, unflinching quality he tried to bring to anything that required real assessment, rather than convenient assessment. His wolf was not making an error. His wolf, for the first time in 3 years, was doing exactly what it was built to do, and doing it correctly, and with complete accuracy. The question was not whether it was making an error. The question was what he was going to do about the fact that it wasn't. He did not have a satisfying answer. He looked at the territory map. He went back to work. The morning after the East Corridor, Dominic dismantled the event systematically, and found that the dismantling held for approximately 3 hours. He was thorough about it. He went through each element with the same analytical precision he applied to boundary disputes and legal matters, and everything else that could be understood through careful examination of its components. He drew on the reading he had done in the months after Diane died, when he had needed to construct a framework for his new life, and that framework included everything available on extended dormancy wolves, and the documented anomalies that dormancy could produce in the instinctual responses. False resonance was real. It was documented and understood. A wolf in extended dormancy was a different instrument than a wolf in ordinary function, and different instruments made different errors. By 10 o'clock, he had a solid framework. By 1 in the afternoon, the framework had developed the specific thinness of something maintained by effort rather than structural integrity. The problem was that he was aware of where she was in the house. Specifically and distinctly and continuously aware. When she was in the kitchen in the morning, he knew it in the way you know a specific sound that is distinct from everything else in a room. When her footsteps passed his study door, he noted the time without choosing to. He was working through a document at 2 in the afternoon when some part of him registered that she had moved from the second floor to the east corridor, and he became aware of this before any conscious signal could account for it. He put the document down. He was capable of working while distracted. He had been doing it for 3 years. He had the architecture for it. You identified the thing that was occupying the background of your attention. You assessed whether it required immediate action. You determined that it did not, and you returned your foreground attention to the task. He did this now. It worked for about 45 minutes at a time, before the background thing reasserted itself. He got through the morning's agenda. He got through the conference call, and the estate manager's report, and the afternoon correspondence. He ate lunch at his desk and worked through it. He did everything that needed to be done, and he did it correctly. And the only evidence that anything was different about this particular day was the document he had been reading before lunch, which he had read a section of 8 times before it made proper contact with his thinking. Owen came to the study doorway at 3 o'clock and stopped when he saw Dominic's expression. "Is something wrong?" Owen asked. "No," Dominic said. Owen looked at him for a moment. "You've been at that document since 9 this morning," he said. "That document is 11 pages. I'm being thorough," Dominic said. Owen looked at him for another beat. He had known Dominic for 11 years and could read the difference between a refusal that was temporary and one that was meant to hold. He nodded once and went back to his office. Dominic sat still at his desk for a moment. Then he went for a run. He went north to the ridge, and along it, and back, and he went hard, harder than necessary, harder than the run required. His wolf ran fully beside him, awake and fast and not confused about anything, and by the time he returned to the manor an hour and a half later, breathing hard and his legs genuinely tired, he had achieved physical exhaustion and nothing else. His wolf was just as awake and just as certain as it had been when he started. He came back through the side entrance. He did not go near the east corridor. He went upstairs and changed and sat at his desk and worked through the evening, with an efficiency that was, if he was completely honest with himself, operating at about 2/3 of its usual capacity. He ate dinner at his desk. He worked until midnight. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and his wolf was awake and certain and saying the same word it had been saying since Tuesday evening. He told himself, for the 3rd night running, that he was an alpha, that he governed himself, and that he was going to carry this thing he had decided not to act on. He lay awake for a long time. His wolf waited. It did not argue, and it did not demand. It simply waited, with the specific patience of something that has found what it has always been looking for, and does not feel the need to hurry, because what it has found is not going anywhere. The ceiling was very high, and very still in the dark. By the 4th day, Dominic had stopped trying to convince himself of the false resonance theory, and had started working on something different: acceptance. Not acceptance of what his wolf was telling him. He was not ready for that, was not sure he would ever be ready for that in any simple or uncomplicated way, but acceptance of the fact that he was going to have to carry this for an indeterminate period, and that carrying it was something he was going to do with the same discipline and consistency he brought to everything else that required discipline and consistency. He had carried difficult things before. He would carry this one. That was the resolution he arrived at on the 4th morning, and it was not a comfortable resolution, but it was a workable one. He could be professional and fair and precisely correct in the running of his household, while also carrying something in the private, wordless interior of himself that did not show on his face and did not affect anyone in the house, and was simply his to manage. He was good at managing things privately. He had been doing it for 3 years. The difficulty with this resolution was that carrying the thing, and also being unaware of her location in the house at every moment of the day, turned out to be 2 requirements that were in tension with each other. He could manage one or the other, but managing both simultaneously was proving more demanding than he had anticipated. He became, over the course of that first week after Tuesday, very good at the specific skill of noticing a thing and immediately doing nothing about it. He noticed when her footsteps were on the 2nd floor. He noticed the quality of the air near the east corridor when she had recently been in it. He noticed, in the kitchen doorway one morning, when he had been heading for the water jug, and she was restocking the shelves with her back to him, that his wolf had become very attentive, in a way that made holding his own expression completely neutral, a practice requiring active effort. He got the water. He went back to his study. He worked. He was managing. Owen watched this happening from a professional distance and said nothing directly about it, which was one of the things Dominic valued most about Owen. He could see that Owen was watching. He could see, from the particular quality of Owen's quiet on the mornings they reviewed the schedule together, that Owen had registered something different about Dominic's behavior, without having identified its source. But Owen was too experienced and too respectful to name a thing that had not been named to him, and so he watched and said nothing, and kept the schedule running smoothly. On Thursday morning, walking past the library, Dominic heard her voice for the first time in anything more than a single practical word. She was speaking to Beth, quietly, about the correct way to fold the long tablecloths so they did not develop creases at the wrong points. Her voice was low and even. There was a specific quality to it that he identified without being able to fully name, the quality of a voice that had learned to be careful, that had at some point in its history decided that measured and quiet was safer than anything else, and had maintained that decision for long enough that it had become natural. He kept walking. He did not slow down. He did not stop. He continued down the corridor and up the stairs to his study, and he sat down at his desk and picked up the document he needed to review. He read it. It took him 3 tries to get through the first paragraph. None of this showed on his face. None of it changed the way he moved through his house or ran his pack or conducted his business. He remained, to everyone who interacted with him, exactly what he had always been: precise, controlled, present, reliable. He was managing the thing he was carrying in exactly the way he had decided he would manage it. This was, he told himself, sufficient. This was what was available to him, given what was true, and he was making the best possible use of what was available. He held to this for the first week. He was still holding to it when Friday came, and the schedule for the following week arrived in his correspondence, and the staffing notes at the bottom of Clara's report mentioned that the delegation from the Callaway pack would be arriving the following Friday evening for a formal dinner, and that the serving staff would be Lena and Nina. He read this. He moved on to the next item. His wolf was completely still and completely awake. He moved on. He spent the remaining days of the week in the same way he spent most days, working through the agenda, managing the pack, maintaining the household, carrying the thing he had decided to carry, without showing that he was carrying anything. He ran every morning, and every morning his wolf ran fully beside him, and every morning when he returned and went upstairs and sat at his desk, the wolf was precisely as awake and as certain as it had been the previous morning, and the morning before that, and the Tuesday evening, when it had risen out of 3 years of silence, in the course of 2 seconds, standing in a doorway. Carrying it was possible. He was doing it. He was not enjoying it. He was an alpha. He had governed himself through things that had broken lesser men, and he was governing himself through this. That was the whole of what was true, and it was enough. And on the days when it felt like it was not enough, he reminded himself that it had to be enough, because it was what he had decided, and he did not unmake decisions he had made, and then he picked up his pen and went back to work. This was what being the alpha of the Blackstone pack looked like from the inside, 3 years in. In the second month of October, in the year when Lena Hartwell had come through his gate and changed the quality of the silence inside him, without knowing she had done it. He worked. He ran. He carried the thing he was carrying. He managed. The tray incident happened on a Thursday morning. He had been heading through the kitchen corridor for no particular reason, a route he would not normally take, a route he found himself taking with increasing frequency when he was moving between parts of the house, though he did not examine why. She was coming around the corner at the same moment, carrying the full loaded tray of breakfast dishes from the dining room to the service area, and the tray shifted. He saw it shift before she did. He moved without thinking, in the clean, direct way that bypassed all the careful management he had been maintaining for days, and caught the tray with both hands. She reached for it at the same moment. Her hands came down on top of his. The warmth was immediate and complete, and it shot through his hands and up his arms, before he had processed that they were touching, and for 2 seconds, he was aware of nothing, except the weight of the tray, and the warmth of her hands on top of his, and the specific, absolute certainty of his wolf, which had been awake and patient and waiting for something exactly like this. He set the tray down on the shelf in the corridor. He walked on. He walked at his usual pace, measured and even, around the next corner and down the corridor and up the stairs to his study. He sat at his desk. He looked at the wall. He worked. His wolf, for the first time since Tuesday evening, was something close to satisfied, not fully satisfied. But the specific edge of tension it had been carrying since Tuesday had eased slightly, in the specific way of something that has been given a small and insufficient portion of what it needed, and has accepted it as better than nothing. His hands were still warm. He picked up his pen. He worked. He had also, in those days, become aware of an additional layer to the situation that he had not initially registered. His wolf was awake, and his wolf was certain, and his wolf had no interest whatsoever in the distance he had decided to maintain. What this meant practically was that maintaining the distance required more active effort than simply deciding to maintain it. It required, each day, a kind of conscious and deliberate management of something that wanted, at a fundamental and instinctual level, to go in a different direction. He was managing it. He was good at managing things. He was also finding, with each day that passed, that the management was slightly more demanding than it had been the day before. Not because his discipline was failing, but because his wolf had been asleep for 3 years and was now completely awake, and the difference between those two states was the difference between an empty room and a full one. He picked up his pen and went back to the documents on his desk. He read through the section he had been working on, reading it with the full and correct attention that it deserved, applying the whole of his not inconsiderable intelligence to the material in front of him, and not permitting his wolf's particular and persistent certainty to occupy any more of his foreground thinking than was strictly necessary. This was possible. He was doing it. Lena had been telling herself, from her first morning at Blackstone Manor, that the most important thing was to remain unnoticed. This was not a preference. It was a requirement. The structural condition on which everything else rested. Invisible meant safe. Safe meant the room, and the roof, and the wage and the distance remained available. She had been invisible from the first day, and she was good at it, methodical, quiet, thorough, the kind of presence that completed tasks fully and correctly, without leaving any impression on the space beyond the clean and orderly state of things when she was done. What she had not anticipated was becoming visible to someone who was not looking for her. She noticed it first on the 5th day after the Tuesday. Though she had not yet connected what she was noticing to any specific event, she was simply aware, gradually and then with increasing clarity, that the Alpha, who in her first days at the manor had been essentially part of the background, permanent, and not requiring attention, had begun to appear in the parts of the house where she was. It was not obvious. There was nothing she could point to, or confront, or explain to someone who had not been paying the specific kind of attention she had been paying for 10 months. He appeared at the end of a corridor she was working in, and walked through without acknowledging her. He came into the main kitchen while she was restocking the shelves, and left by the far door. She was on the 2nd floor landing, and he came up the stairs and turned left. None of this was unusual in any single instance. People moved through a large house, paths crossed. But she had spent 10 months developing a precise and reliable sensitivity to the difference between coincidence and pattern in the behavior of the people around her, because that difference had sometimes been the difference between safe and not safe, and she felt the pattern here, even though she could not have quantified it to anyone's satisfaction. She reviewed everything she had done since arriving, every task, every rule, every interaction with every member of the household. She could not find an error. She had been meticulous. She had been, by every standard she could identify, exactly what she was supposed to be. She said nothing. She watched. She kept her face and her bearing exactly as they always were, even, professional, focused on whatever was immediately in front of her. She was carrying the loaded wooden tray from the main kitchen to the service area on a Thursday morning, when the tray shifted. She had taken the corner correctly. The tray was heavy, stacked with the dishes from the household's breakfast service, and the weight distribution was not quite right, and as she came around the narrowing of the corridor past the corner, the tray began to tip to the left, with the slow, terrible inevitability of something that was going to fall, regardless of what happened in the next half-second. She grabbed for the edge. She was not fast enough. He came around the corner from the other direction at that precise moment, and his hands came up and caught the tray before she had fully registered that he was there. The movement was fast and clean, and without hesitation, the reflex of a body that acts before any decision is made. He had the tray fully stabilized before the dishes could have shifted significantly. She reached for it at the same moment. Her hands came down on top of his. The warmth hit her before she had processed any of the rest of it, both palms at once, and it spread upward through her arms and across her chest in a single fast wave. It was not like heat from an external source, not temperature in the ordinary sense. It was like something inside her that had been held in a cold and contracted state for a long time was suddenly, completely released from that state. She felt it in her palms, in her chest, behind her sternum, in the specific place that had been quiet and carefully sealed for the entire 10 months she had been moving through the world alone. For 2 seconds it was the only thing she was aware of. She stepped back. She pulled her hands away quickly and took a step back and put distance between herself and the tray. He set it down on the corridor shelf, smooth and certain, straightened, and walked on around the corner. He didn't look at her, or the look was so brief and so immediately withdrawn that it functioned as not looking. His pace didn't change. He went around the corner, and his footsteps continued down the corridor, and then were gone. Lena stood in the corridor. She looked at her hands. The warmth was still there, not as strong as it had been in those 2 seconds, but still present, fading the way an afterimage fades, slowly, leaving something behind in the palms and across the chest. She stood there for a moment longer than she should have, just standing with the tray on the shelf beside her, and her arms at her sides. Then she picked up the tray and continued to the service area. She completed the rest of the morning's tasks with the methodical care she always brought to what mattered. She ate lunch and listened to Nina. She ironed the guest room linens and restocked the cupboard. She swept the east corridor. She did not think about the warmth. She lay in bed that night with her hands flat against the blanket. The warmth was at the edges of her awareness. It had not fully left. It was quiet and patient and not demanding anything, not pushing anywhere. Simply present, the way something is present when it does not need to be loud. She was frightened of it. She identified this precisely, using the correct word, because mislabeling her own internal states was a luxury she had not been able to afford for the past year. She was frightened not because the warmth felt threatening. It did not feel threatening, which was itself the problem, but because she wanted it. She recognized, in the specific honest space of her own thoughts late at night, that she wanted the warmth. She wanted those 2 seconds in the corridor to have lasted longer than 2 seconds. She wanted the feeling of her hands on top of his. She was frightened of wanting something she could not afford to have. She was frightened specifically and precisely because of where it was coming from. The alpha of this household. The man she needed to remain invisible to. The man around whose controlled and private grief the entire atmosphere of this house was organized. She pressed her hands flat against the blanket. She told herself, clearly and firmly, that this was not something she was in a position to want. She told herself this for a long time. And in the honest, quiet space of the late night, where she was the only audience for her own thinking, she admitted that the telling had not been entirely convincing. There was something in the direction of him that she could not quite account for in any ordinary way, and the warmth in her hands from the corridor was only the most recent instance of it. She had noticed things for days now, not obviously, not in any way she would have been able to explain to Nina or anyone else, but in the specific way she noticed things that mattered. The quality of his attention when he was in a room with her, even when he was not looking at her. The way her own awareness of the house sharpened slightly whenever he was near, like the volume of something being turned up a fraction. She did not have language for any of this that she trusted. She did not have a framework that was adequate. She closed her eyes. She told herself again that this was not something she could afford. She told herself this until she was almost convinced, and then she lay in the dark and listened to the house settle, and the pines move in the wind, and let the night do what the night did, which was pass, 1 minute at a time, toward morning. The days that followed had a specific quality to them. She had been in many difficult situations over the past 10 months, and had developed a reliable sense for the difference between a situation that was genuinely dangerous and a situation that was merely uncomfortable. And what she was living in now was something she did not yet have a category for. It was not dangerous in any way she could name. Nothing threatened her here. Nothing had changed in the household. Nothing had happened that she could report to Clara, or to Owen, or to anyone who dealt in practical, nameable concerns. What had changed was the quality of her attention when he was anywhere near her. She became, over the days that followed the corridor, very good at a specific skill she had not previously needed, being in the same space as someone whose presence she was intensely aware of, while giving absolutely no outward indication of this awareness. She had always been good at managing her external presentation. She had 10 months of practice at maintaining a face that showed less than she was actually thinking and feeling, but this was a more demanding version of that skill, because the thing she was managing was not fear or watchfulness or the low-level operational tension she was used to. It was something else entirely, something that wanted her to turn toward it rather than away from it, and the effort of not turning toward it was more tiring than she had expected. She worked. She completed her tasks. She ate meals with Nina and Beth and participated in their conversations, and was, by any reasonable external assessment, a functioning and reliable member of the household staff who was settling into the placement well. Inside the careful management of her own face, she was thinking about warmth in the palms of her hands. She was also, underneath all of that, in the deepest and most honest part of her thinking, beginning to notice something that frightened her, in a way that the warmth itself did not frighten her. She was beginning to notice that some part of her, some very fundamental and instinctual part that did not consult the rest of her before forming opinions, had decided that this house was a place she wanted to stay. Not just for now. Not just as a temporary arrangement. As a place. She had not felt this about anywhere in 10 months. She did not know what to do with it, and so she put it in the same internal space where she kept everything she could not act on, and she went on doing her job, and she was careful, and she kept her face even, and the warmth in her hands was there every night when she lay in the dark, fading a little more each day but not fully leaving, patient as everything else about the situation was patient, simply there, waiting for her to decide what she was going to do with it. She had not decided yet. She was fairly certain she was not going to be allowed to keep not deciding for very much longer. There was one more thing that she noticed during those days, and it was small enough that she might have dismissed it as nothing, if she had not been the kind of person who noticed things and did not dismiss them. When she passed the study door in the mornings, she sometimes caught a half-second pause in whatever was happening inside it. Not obvious, not something she could have proven. A fractional shift in the quality of the silence beyond the door, the way a sound changes very slightly when someone stops moving and is standing very still instead. She passed the door, and the pause happened, and then the sound of work resumed, and she continued down the corridor with her basket of cleaning supplies, and her face exactly as it always was. She noted it. She did not know what to do with it. She filed it in the same place she filed everything else she could not currently act on, and she went on doing her job. She was very good at going on doing her job. It was almost the thing she was best at, this year, in this particular and unexpected life she was living. She was good at going on, at continuing, at putting one foot in front of the other, through situations that were complicated, and uncertain, and not what she had planned. She had been doing it for 10 months. She was still doing it now, in a manner in the Northern Territory, carrying a warmth in her hands that she had not invited, and could not fully set aside, serving the household of a man whose wolf had apparently decided something that neither of them had asked it to decide, and waiting, as she always waited, to see what the next thing would be. On Saturday morning, her day off, the first full one she had taken since arriving, she sat at the small desk in her room with a cup of tea and made a list of what she actually knew, on a separate page of the notepad from the one she used for the letter. Not what she feared, not what she was uncertain about, what she actually knew. She knew that the warmth in her hands had not fully left in 5 days. She knew that passing the study door in the mornings had become a moment she was aware of before she reached it. She knew that when he came into a room she was working in, the quality of her own attention shifted in a way she could not account for through any ordinary explanation. She knew that her wolf, which had been quiet since the marking ceremony, which had been quiet through all 10 months of movement and fear, and the grinding daily work of staying unseen, had not been entirely quiet in this house. She sat with her list. She read it once. She tore it into careful pieces, the same way she always tore the letter, and put the pieces in the bin. She looked out the window at the garden wall. She did not know what to do with what she knew. She was not in a position to do anything with it, and even if she were in a position, she had no framework that was adequate for it, and even if she had a framework, she did not yet trust the stability of her situation enough to let herself build on it. but she was willing to admit, in the specific privacy of a Saturday morning in her own room, that what she knew mattered, that it was real, that it was not nothing. She sat with this. Then she drank her tea. She had been at the manor for 3 weeks when she sat down on the edge of her bed on a Thursday night and began the letter she would tear up before morning. She wrote it the same way every time. Desk lamp on, curtains drawn, door locked, the plain notepad angled toward her on the desk surface. No name at the top, no address, nothing that would indicate a recipient, because it had none. It was an accounting. A truthful record of where she was and how she had arrived here, written down in her own careful and even handwriting, so that the facts of her life existed somewhere outside the interior of her own head, where they could be seen clearly instead of felt confusingly. She had found, in the worst months of the past year, that the act of writing things down separated the fact of them from the weight of them, that named and recorded things were smaller and more manageable than the same things unnamed and unfiled, that seeing the truth of her situation in her own handwriting on a page gave her a better relationship with it than keeping it all compressed inside herself, where it interacted with her fear and her exhaustion in ways that were not always useful. She had been writing this letter, in different rooms in different towns, since the beginning. She wrote from the beginning now. She had been born in the Southern Territory, in a town that sat close enough to pack land for the pack world to be a permanent background presence in ordinary life. Not hostile, not welcoming, simply there, as another layer of the world that organized certain things in certain ways, and that you factored in the way you factored in anything structural about your environment. Her parents were not pack. They carried human blood and something older thinned through several generations into a peripheral awareness of the pack world without a formal place inside it. She had grown up in both worlds and had belonged to neither formally, and this had suited her. She had thought she understood what she was. At 17, she found out that her understanding was incomplete. The Omega nature had emerged the way things emerge when they have been building below the surface for a long time, without announcing themselves, gradually and then suddenly, in the way of water working through stone. First a new quality in the air around her that she did not yet have words for. Then the specific quality of attention she began to draw from the wolves in the nearest pack when she passed through the town near the boundary. Then the visit. 2 men from the Voss pack came to her parents' home on a Saturday afternoon in late March. They were polite and organized, with the practiced ease of people who had done this before and had refined the script for it. She was an unmated Omega, discovered in territory adjacent to Voss pack land. Pack law gave the nearest alpha the right of formal approach. Gerald Voss wished to exercise that right and to extend to her a formal place within his pack's structure. She had been 17 years old, sitting in her parents' front room, listening to 2 men she had never seen explain to her that her nature was something other people had claims on. Her parents had not known what to do. They were not pack. They did not have the experience or the knowledge to understand the full shape of what was being offered, and the 2 men from the Voss pack had not offered alternatives, and the week that followed produced nothing that was clearly better than reluctant cooperation. Refusing a formal request from the alpha of the neighboring pack, for a family living in the territory that bordered that pack's land, had a shape to it that was visible to anyone thinking about it clearly. She had gone with the 2 men the following week. She spent 3 years inside the Voss pack structure. She was fed and housed and given work within the pack's domestic organization that was real and that she did well. She was treated, by the formal accounting, adequately. She was not mistreated in any way that could be named and pointed to, and this, she had come to understand over those 3 years, was itself a form of deliberate skill on Gerald Voss's part. He was very good at constructing situations that were technically acceptable and practically something else entirely. The structure tightened over time, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, in the way a space becomes gradually smaller, without any single moment you can identify as the moment the change happened. The source of the tightening was Gerald himself, who communicated his intentions for her through a long series of individual conversations that were each, separately, deniable as merely informational, and collectively, unmistakably, a design. The marking ceremony was the end point of his design. It was presented as a formalization, a natural next step in the process of her full integration into the pack. She had no opportunity to decline. Her wolf refused. She had not known for certain it would. She had hoped. with the specific careful hope of someone who is holding something fragile that they cannot afford to drop. And her wolf refused completely, without ambiguity, without any possibility of the refusal being read as hesitation or delay. Whatever Gerald Voss was, he was not the thing her wolf recognized as its counterpart. Her wolf communicated this in the only language available to it: absolute and unmistakable refusal. She had looked at Gerald's face in the long moment afterward. The fury in it was cold and entirely contained, which made it far more frightening than heat would have been. He had not said anything to her that evening. He had simply looked at her, and in the quality of his look she had understood exactly what she was now: a problem of a different kind than she had been before. She left 4 nights later. She spent 4 nights watching the northern section of the pack compound boundary and learning the precise timing of the gap between 2 patrol passes. She spent those nights moving a small number of essential things to a place she could access quickly in the dark. On the 4th night, between the passes, she walked out through the northern boundary. She walked 2 miles to the nearest road. She did not look back once. In the 3rd month, at a bus station she could no longer name with certainty, a woman she had never met pressed a small wrapped package into her hands and said, without being asked, that these herbs, boiled and added to her bath every 3 days, would help with what she was hiding. She had taken the package and asked nothing. She had not missed a dose since. 10 months. 10 months of movement and careful management, and the particular daily practice of constructing a life out of temporary materials that might need to be picked up and relocated at any point. She tore the letter up now. She always tore it up. The writing was what mattered. The tearing was the completion of the practice. She put the pieces in the small bin beside the desk and sat for a moment with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the window. The garden wall outside, dark and still, the sky above it. She thought, with the careful speed she had developed for exactly this kind of thinking, about what she would do if she were found here. Which door? Which direction? How far to a public road? She ran the route through her mind, not because she was about to use it, but because maintaining the route in active memory was itself a form of safety, a form of not letting herself become too settled to function if she needed to move. She was not about to be found. She had no specific reason to believe that. She was simply being honest with herself about her situation. She also thought, in the private space of the late evening, about the warmth in her hands from the corridor, about the pause she sometimes heard beyond the study door when she passed it, about the specific quality of awareness that had become part of the texture of her days in this house, and that she did not yet have adequate language for. She was thinking about this when Nina knocked. Nina's voice was light and easy through the door. "Lena, Beth and I are making tea. Are you in?" Lena looked at the bin with the torn pieces in it. She looked at the window. She put everything away in the specific internal space she had built for it over the past year. Every calculation, every route, every named and unnamed thing she was carrying. Neat, organized, contained, not visible on her face. She stood up. "Yes," she called. "I'll be right there." She opened the door, and Nina was in the corridor with a mug already in hand, steam rising, her face easy and warm. She held the second mug out to Lena without ceremony, and turned toward the staff kitchen. Lena took the mug. She followed Nina down the corridor, and sat at the table, and held the warm ceramic in both hands, and let the ordinary, small conversation of the evening move around her. And she was present in it, as much as she was capable of being present in anything right now. And the tea was warm, and the kitchen was lit against the October dark, and there was, in this moment, nothing she needed to do except be here. It was enough. It was always enough. She was very practiced at making it enough. She sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour, long enough for the tea to be finished and another cup to be offered and accepted, and for Nina to move through 2 different topics of conversation and land on a third, which was a book she had started reading on her last day off and wasn't sure whether she liked or not. Beth had an opinion about the book, which she delivered in the concise and definitive manner in which Beth delivered all her opinions, and Nina considered it with the open, thoughtful seriousness that Nina brought to most things. Lena listened. She contributed where she could. She was genuinely present in this conversation, or as genuinely present as she ever was in anything, which was always somewhat less than fully present because some portion of her attention was always allocated to the background practice of monitoring her environment. She was aware, at some point during the book conversation, that this monitoring felt different in this house than it had in most of the other places she had spent time over the past 10 months. It was still present. It would not go away simply because she was behind a locked gate and in a house staffed by people who meant her no harm. The monitoring was not a rational decision she made each day. It was a conditioned response that had become part of the architecture of her daily functioning, and architecture did not change because the circumstances changed. But the quality of it was different here. The urgency was lower. The signal was quieter. The place in the back of her chest where the monitoring lived was not as tight as it had been in most of the other places she had been. She thought about what Dominic had said in the kitchen that early morning, that while she was on this property, she was under the protection of this pack. She thought about the specific, level tone in which he had said it. Not comforting, not warm in any obvious way, but absolutely certain. The tone of someone stating a fact that was simply true and did not require decoration. She thought about his face when he had looked at her after Gerald left. The specific quality of what was in his eyes in that moment. Not satisfaction, not triumph, nothing that performed the victory. Just something steady, something that looked like, I said I would, and I did, and that is the whole of it. She picked up her mug. She finished the second cup of tea. She said goodnight to Nina and Beth, and went to her room, and lay down on her bed in the dark, and looked at the ceiling. The house was quiet around her. The pines moved at the far boundary. The October sky outside her window was dark and clear. She was safe. The word had started to mean something real again, in this house, in the past few days. Not the word she told herself every night, as a practiced reassurance. The actual condition. The thing the word described. She closed her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she fell asleep quickly. After Nina left her at the door of her room that night, she stood for a moment in the quiet of her room, and did something she had not done in a very long time. She let herself imagine staying. Not in a detailed or specific way, not planning, not mapping out a future, not attaching any conditions or requirements to the imagining. Just, what if this house was the house? What if these people were the people? What if the work she did here, the tasks she completed, and the standards she maintained, and the quiet, competent, methodical way she had begun to inhabit this space, was the work she did here for longer than a few weeks? What would that be like? She stood in the quiet of her room and let herself imagine it for approximately 30 seconds. Then she put the imagining away, with the practiced care of someone who has learned that imagining too far ahead produces a specific and counterproductive kind of pain, and she got ready for bed. But she noticed, as she lay down and looked at the ceiling, that the imagining had not been frightening in the way she had expected it to be. She had expected the familiar sharp anxiety of something that can be taken away, the thing that had kept her from imagining ahead for 10 months. But the imagining had not felt like that. It had felt like something that might be possible, which was different. She filed this. She did not examine it too closely. She closed her eyes. The delegation from the Callaway pack arrived at Blackstone Manor on a Friday evening, and Lena had been aware of it since Wednesday morning. Clara had told both her and Nina that 8 guests were expected for a formal dinner Friday night, and that they would manage the full service between them. The brief was complete: the menu, the 5-course sequence, the timing, and the specific standard for formal pack dinner service, which was quiet, efficient, and professional to the point of invisibility. The guests should not have to think about the staff. The staff should be present at exactly the right moment, and otherwise absent from the room's awareness entirely. Nina had found this interesting. She asked questions about the Callaway pack's territory, and made detailed notes about the menu sequence, and seemed, overall, to approach the occasion as a welcome variation from the ordinary week. Lena had listened to the complete brief, and then, on Wednesday afternoon, walked through the main dining room twice, at different hours. She noted the layout of the table, the position of each chair, the location of the service door, the kitchen door, the corridor door, the main entrance. She noted the distance from each point in the room to each exit, and the approximate time it would take to reach each one. She did this in every new space she spent time in. She had stopped examining the habit. The guests arrived at 6:30. 7 men and 1 woman, formally dressed, moving through the front door of the manor, with the specific composed ease of people who were accustomed to being in important rooms. The alpha of the Callaway pack, a broad, dark-haired man named Henderson, shook Dominic's hand with the precise care of an alpha who was strong, but who understood he was on another alpha's territory, and governed his manner accordingly. His delegation arranged themselves behind him with the practiced naturalness of people who knew their positions without being told. Lena watched them enter from the kitchen, through the narrow glass panel in the service door. She watched the way they moved, the way the delegation oriented itself around Henderson, the way Henderson's eyes went quickly around the entry hall and the visible portion of the dining room before settling on his host. Nina appeared at her elbow. "Ready?" "Yes," Lena said. She picked up the first-course tray and went in. The dining room was warm with candlelight and the low amber wall sconces Clara had authorized for formal occasions. Conversation was already established when Lena entered, something about the shared road and last season's weather complications on the northern routes, and she moved into the room and along the left-hand side of the table and placed the first-course plates with the quiet efficiency that Clara expected. She completed the left-hand side and crossed to the right. She was placing the fourth plate on the right-hand side, her attention on the table and the spacing of the silver, when the candlelight caught the pin on the lapel of the man seated third from the far end of the table. She saw it in periphery. She might have missed it entirely if she had not passed very close to his chair, and the candles at the center of the table had not thrown their light at exactly that angle. A stylized claw, small, dark metal on a dark backing. She placed the fourth plate. She moved to the fifth position. She placed the fifth plate. She walked back to the service door at exactly the pace she had maintained throughout, carrying the empty tray at her side. In the kitchen, she set the tray down on the counter, both palms flat against the counter surface. She breathed. The Voss Pack identifier, not the formal crest, that was reserved for official occasions and was large and detailed and unmistakable. This was the personal emblem, the quiet signal that a pack member wore when they were outside their territory to let other wolves know, "I belong to the Voss Pack." Subtle enough that most humans would not register it. Specific enough that anyone who had spent 3 years inside that pack structure would know it instantly and absolutely. She knew it. She breathed through the next 4 seconds carefully, the specific breathing she used when she needed her thinking to be faster than her fear. She ran the immediate calculations. Did he know who she was? He had not looked at her during the first-course service. She was almost certain, having been watching from peripheral vision throughout. Was his presence here coincidental? A Voss Pack member in a Callaway delegation was possible but not common. Inter-pack liaison arrangements existed. It could be straightforward. It was not the first explanation she would reach for, given everything else she knew. She did not know whether he was here because of inter-pack business or because of her. She needed to continue serving the dinner. Nina came through the service door, carrying the second-course materials, and stopped, looking at Lena's face. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Lena said. She picked up the second tray. "Let's go." She went back into the dining room. She served the second course, and the third, and the fourth, with every resource she had for maintaining professional control under pressure. She looked at the table, the plates, the guests' needs. She regulated her pace. She moved past the man with the pin, without changing her stride, or the angle of her body, or the direction of her gaze, by any detectable degree. During the third course, she heard his name. The Callaway Alpha addressed a comment to the man with the pin. Fletcher, something about a boundary survey reference. Just the name. She filed it with the precise, economical efficiency she had developed for useful information. During the dessert course, she was at the far end of the table with the water jug when she saw Fletcher's hand go beneath the edge of the table. A brief screen glow. His fingers moved quickly. The phone disappeared. She poured water into the glass in front of her. She moved to the next glass. She poured and moved and was exactly what she was supposed to be. In the same moment, across the room, Dominic was in conversation with Henderson about something related to the road costs. She was at the far end of the table and could not see his face directly. But she caught, in the peripheral way she caught things that mattered, a fractional shift in the set of his shoulders, a pause of 1 beat in the flow of his conversation. His eyes, for a single moment, not on Henderson. Then he continued. She completed the dessert service. She cleared every plate correctly. She made no errors. She and Nina cleaned the dining room after the guests moved to the reception room, working quickly and in near silence. When the last of the tableware was on the kitchen cart, Lena dried her hands and said goodnight, and went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark. She thought, clearly and practically, about what she knew and what she feared, and what the difference between those two things required of her tonight. She thought about the phone, and Fletcher, and the fractional shift in Dominic's posture. She thought about probability, and about the specific danger of letting fear produce certainty before certainty was warranted. She thought about the quality of Dominic's posture again. He had seen something. She was as certain as she allowed herself to be, given that she was working with peripheral observation and inference. He had seen something, and he had noted it, and he had continued his conversation without giving any indication that he had noted it, because that was what he did. She thought about what that meant. She pressed her hands flat on her knees. She went to bed. The night was very long, and she lay in the dark and thought carefully through every element of her situation, and by 2 in the morning she had not resolved any of it, and by 3 she was close enough to sleep to lose the thread of her thinking, and by 4 she was in the kitchen with the kettle on and her bag on the chair beside her. The dinner service had lasted 3 hours from start to finish. 3 hours of moving through a room where a man with a Voss pack identifier sat 3 places from the end of the table, and she had moved through every one of those hours with the full control she had developed for exactly this kind of pressure. She was tired. The specific tired of 3 hours of sustained performance under pressure that does not show on the outside, which was more exhausting than most physical effort because it drew on a resource that was finite and that she had not had the chance to properly replenish. She sat in her room after the dinner and reviewed the situation one more time. Fletcher had been in the room. Fletcher had seen her. She could not be certain whether he had recognized her, but he had been in the room, and at some point during the evening his eyes had found her, and then had moved on, and she did not know what he had taken from that brief encounter. He had used his phone. He had typed quickly and put it away. These were the facts. What she did not have were the facts about what came after those facts. Whether the message had been to someone in the Voss pack, whether the content of the message had been about her, or about something else entirely. Whether a response had been sent, whether right now something was being arranged that she needed to be ahead of. She did not know. What she knew was that not knowing was itself information. She had been running for 10 months on incomplete information. The practice was to take what was known, identify what was unknown, assess what was actionable, and make the best available decision. The best available decision, right now, was to stay alert and wait for more information. She was very good at staying alert. She lay down and stared at the ceiling, and stayed alert, and the hours of the night passed with the slow, patient quality of hours that are not sleeping, but are not entirely waking either. And at some point past 3 in the morning, she became aware that her bag was on the chair beside the bed, and that she had packed it at some point in the night without fully deciding to. She looked at the bag for a long time. Then she got up and went to the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She made tea. She sat at the table and held the mug in both hands and looked at the window and thought about what she was doing. She was sitting in a warm kitchen in a well-run household at 4 in the morning with a bag half packed on the chair beside her because a man she didn't know had used his phone at a dinner table. This was what 10 months of running had done to her. This was the mechanism. A single event, a single piece of ambiguous information, and the whole structure of preparedness she had built, activated itself, and started moving her toward the door before she had consciously decided anything. She looked at the bag. She looked at the mug. She thought about the fact that she had, for the first time in 10 months, fallen asleep quickly the previous night, in this house. The kettle had finished. The tea was warm in her hands. The kitchen was warm and quiet around her, and the house breathed around her in its patient, old stone way. She heard the door open. She did not turn immediately. She heard the footstep just inside the door, and then turned at her own pace, with her face already arranged. Dominic Blackstone was in the kitchen doorway. She looked at him in the low amber light, and he looked at her, and then he looked at the bag on the chair beside her. He said, in a voice that was completely level, "Where are you planning to go?" She set her mug down. "I don't know what you mean." He came into the kitchen. He moved to the counter on the far side of the island, from where she was sitting, putting it between them, and stood there with his hands resting on the surface, not coming toward her, not using the space to reduce her options. Simply present, in the specific way she was beginning to recognize as his particular quality of being present, fully, without performance, with his attention entirely on the thing in front of him. "You packed at some point last night," he said. "I heard you. You walked the corridor at 3:45. He paused. "I hear most of what happens in this house." She looked at him. She thought about Nina's description of the East Corridor after 9, and the particular heaviness of encountering him in those hours. "I was awake," he said simply. "I usually am, at that hour." She said, "You saw Fletcher at the dinner." "Yes," he said. "I know the Vospak identifier. I also know what it means when a man at a formal dinner uses his phone discreetly during the dessert course." The kitchen was quiet. He said, "Tell me what you're running from." She looked at her hands on the table, and then she told him. He looked at her. She looked back at him, and the kitchen was warm and amber lit around them, and the sky outside the window was showing, at its very lowest edge, the first faint suggestion of the coming morning. She set her mug down. She breathed. She said, "The man at the dinner had a Vospak identifier on his lapel." Something in him went very still, not surprised. She could see that he was not surprised. Something more specific than stillness, actually. The quality of a man who had been waiting for certain information to be confirmed, and has just had it confirmed, and who is now in the process of reorganizing everything he has already been thinking around the confirmed fact. "I know," he said. "I saw it." She looked at him. "I also know what it means when a man at a formal dinner uses his phone during the dessert course and covers the screen," he said. "I've been running this pack for 11 years. I know what those two things together look like." She said, "You knew." "I had a strong hypothesis," he said. "I needed you to tell me the rest." She thought about this. She thought about the specific quality of his stillness at the head of the dinner table, which she had caught in periphery for a single moment. Not alarm, not anxiety. The stillness of someone processing information and filing it for later action. "How long have you been preparing for today?" she said. "Since Saturday morning," he said. She looked at him. "Tell me the rest," he said again, and something in his voice was not a demand, but was not quite a request either. It was the tone of someone who has cleared the space and is simply waiting, patiently and completely, for the person in front of him to use it. She told him the rest. She told him everything. Not all at once, not as a prepared statement or a practiced account. She had never told this story to anyone in its complete form, had told pieces of it to no one, had been carrying the whole of it alone since the night she walked out through the northern boundary with nothing but her clothes and a memorized map. It came out the way something comes out after long compression, in pieces, each one following the last, the telling of it finding its own momentum once she had started. She told him about the two men who came to her parents' home in March, when she was 17. She told him about the 3 years inside the Vospak structure, about the way the structure tightened without ever producing a single moment she could have named as the moment of change, about Gerald's conversations, each one deniable on its own, collectively unmistakable. She told him about the marking ceremony. She told him what her wolf had done. She told him what Gerald's face had looked like in the long moment afterward, the cold and absolutely contained quality of the fury in it, the specific calculation she had watched begin behind his eyes, in the seconds following the failure. She told him about the 4 nights of preparation, about walking out in the dark through the boundary and not looking back. She told him about the 10 months since, about the herbs she used, which she had been given by a woman she would not recognize if she saw her again, about the agency and the names she used that were not her real name, about the plan she always kept current in the back of her mind, which door, which direction, how far to a public road. She told him about Fletcher and the pin on his lapel and the phone during the dessert course. He stood at the counter throughout all of it without moving and without interrupting. He listened with the specific total attention of someone who has decided that listening is the whole of what this moment requires, and who has given himself to that decision completely. He did not express alarm, or offer premature reassurance, or do anything except receive what she was saying, with the steadiness of someone who has dealt with difficult information before, and has learned to take it in without flinching. When she stopped, the kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the sky had begun to lighten at the very edge of the horizon. Not dawn yet, just the first withdrawal of total dark, the first suggestion that morning was somewhere, and was approaching. He exhaled slowly through his nose. "You're not going anywhere," he said. She looked up. "You are on Blackstone Pack territory," he said. His voice was clear and level. "Every person on this property is under this pack's protection while they are here. That is pack law, applied to you the same way it applies to everyone else within these boundaries." He looked at her steadily. "And now that I understand the specific situation, that protection has specific and active meaning. No one comes here with the intent you have described and leaves with what they came for." She studied his face. She had spent 10 months learning to read the difference between what a face said and what it actually meant, and she looked at his face now with all the precision she had developed. "He meant it," she said. "I don't want to bring trouble here." He said, "That is not your concern to carry." She sat with this for a moment. Outside the window, the sky lightened by another degree, very slowly, the quality of dark becoming something slightly less absolute. He moved to the far end of the counter and stood there. "The man at the dinner," he said. "Fletcher. Do you know if he recognized you?" "I don't know," she said. "He looked at me once. I don't know what he took from it." Dominic nodded once, slowly. "I'll speak to Owen in the morning," he said. "There are things to be done that don't require anything from you." She looked at her hands around the mug. "I have managed this alone for 10 months, she said. "Not defensively, just factually." "I know," he said. "That is over now." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression she had been slowly learning to read, controlled and even on the surface, carrying something underneath the evenness that was not hidden, so much as simply not in the habit of being shown. In this moment, in the low amber light of the kitchen at 5 in the morning, with the sky beginning to lighten outside the window, that something underneath the evenness was closer to the surface than she had seen it. She did not know what to call it. She looked at it for a moment longer than she meant to. Then she looked back at her mug. "Okay," she said quietly. It was a very small word, for a very large thing she was agreeing to. "Good," he said. He straightened from the counter. He said what functioned as good night. He went back through the door he had come in through. The kitchen was quiet around her. She sat for a long while. She looked at the window, at the sky that was slowly becoming light. She listened to the house breathe around her. Then she reached over and picked up the bag from the chair beside her and placed it on the floor under the table. She did not unpack it. She was not ready to unpack it. That would require a kind of settled faith in the stability of things that she was still building toward, and she would not pretend to it before she had it, but she moved it off the chair, out of the immediate field of her vision, down under the table where she did not have to look at it. For now was still all she had. But for now, tonight, in this kitchen, with the sky going slowly from dark to gray outside the window, for now was better than it had been in a very long time. She finished her tea. She went back to bed. She fell asleep before the room was fully light. She slept through until 9, which was later than she had slept in months, and she woke to the sound of the household going about its usual morning routine, the distant clatter of the kitchen below her room, the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside, the measured, practical sounds of a house that ran well and on schedule. She lay still for a few minutes and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the conversation in the kitchen at 5 in the morning. She thought about it in the specific way she thought about things that had not yet settled into a category, turning it in her mind, looking at it from different angles, checking it against what she knew about how things worked, and what people said, and whether the two tended to match. He had meant what he said. She was still confident of this after a few hours of sleep. He was not a man who said things he did not mean, and the specific quality of his certainty in the kitchen had not been the certainty of someone who was managing her. It was the certainty of someone stating a fact. She thought about that. She got up and dressed and went to the staff kitchen to eat the breakfast that Clara had left covered for her, and Nina, who was finishing her own meal, looked at her once and did not ask anything, which was the right thing to do, and Lena appreciated it. Owen arrived at the manor at 9:30 and went directly to the study without stopping anywhere else in the house, which told Lena, who was working in the main corridor, that a meeting had been arranged earlier. She continued working. She completed her morning tasks in the order she always completed them, with the attention she always brought to them. At 11 o'clock, Clara told her there would be no formal lunch preparation today, as the Alpha and Owen would be working through the midday hour. Lena said she understood, and went to assist Beth with the second-floor rooms. She did not know what was being planned in the study. She did not need to know. She had told him everything he needed to know to make whatever decisions needed to be made, and he had told her that making those decisions was not her concern, and she had agreed to this, and she was going to hold to the agreement, rather than spending the morning rotating through anxious speculation. She changed the linens on the second-floor guest beds. She swept the second-floor corridor. She cleaned the second-floor bathrooms and restocked the supplies in the correct cupboard. She worked. It was, she was realizing, something that she genuinely valued about this house and this position. The work was real, and it mattered, and there was always enough of it to fill the hours. And when the hours were full of work that she was good at, the space available for the fear to occupy was smaller. The fear did not disappear. It was always present, had been present every day for 10 months, was part of the architecture of her daily functioning now. But it was quieter when the hours were full. It was more manageable. She finished the second floor and went downstairs. In the kitchen, she put the kettle on. She made herself a cup of tea and stood at the kitchen window with it and looked out at the back garden. The garden in October. The stone paths, the dark hedges, the climbing roses along the far wall, the bench near the wall where the roses grew thickest, the bench where she had sometimes sat on her days off, in the 10 minutes after her tasks were done, but before the afternoon set in. She thought about that bench. She thought about him finding her there, and what he had said in the kitchen that morning, and the quality of his face when he said it. She drank her tea. She put the mug in the sink. She went back to work. The day continued in its ordinary way. Lunch was a simple self-service arrangement in the staff kitchen, which Lena ate with Nina and Beth. The afternoon brought her regular set of tasks. She completed them correctly and in order, and Clara reviewed the dining room at 4 o'clock and gave her nod of approval, which was the closest Clara came to expressing satisfaction, and which Lena had learned to receive as the genuine compliment it was. At 6 in the evening, Owen left the manor. She saw his car through the east corridor window as she was completing the last of her afternoon tasks. He drove away down the main gravel path at his usual measured pace, and then the forecourt was empty again. She finished her tasks. She ate dinner with Nina and Beth. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the bag on the floor beside the desk, where she had placed it when she got up that morning. She had not unpacked it. She had not moved it back to the chair. It sat on the floor, half full, waiting for a decision she had not yet made. She thought about the difference between unpacking the bag and not unpacking it. Unpacking the bag would mean something. It would mean that she had decided, with deliberate and clear intention, that she was staying, not just for now, not just until the situation became untenable, staying, as a genuine choice rather than an ongoing temporary arrangement. She had not made that decision yet. But sitting on the edge of the bed looking at the bag, she was aware that she was considerably closer to making it than she had been 24 hours ago. She looked at the bag. She thought about what it would mean to stay. Then she lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling, and let herself, for the first time in 10 months, think past the immediate horizon. Let herself think about the week after this one, and the month after that, and what it might look like to be in one place for long enough that the place became a known thing, a familiar thing. She thought about this for a long time, in the quiet of her room, with the October night pressing against the window. Then she closed her eyes. She slept. She woke later that morning with the specific lightness of someone who has made a decision that was correct. Not the relieved lightness of a burden lifted, exactly, but the settled lightness of something that had been unresolved becoming resolved, the specific quality of the hours after a major decision has been made, and before the complications of implementing it have had time to arrive. She lay still for a moment and let the feeling be present, which was something she had not let herself do very often over the past year. She had learned to move quickly through positive feelings, the way she moved quickly through everything else, not letting herself stop in them too long, because stopping created attachment, and attachment made the next necessary movement harder. She let herself stop in this one for a moment. Then she got up. The morning was ordinary. She ate breakfast, completed her tasks, spoke with Clara about the week's schedule. Owen arrived and went directly to the study. The household ran in its usual smooth and organized way. In the afternoon, she walked past the study door, on her way to the linen cupboard, and she heard, through the closed door, Dominic's voice, on what sounded like a telephone call. His voice had the specific quality it had when he was speaking to someone who required his full attention and complete precision. Measured, deliberate, slightly more formal than his ordinary register. She noted this without stopping. She continued to the linen cupboard. She restocked the shelves in the exact order Clara required and returned to the main corridor. She did not know what was being arranged. She understood that something was being arranged, and that its purpose was related to what had happened at the dinner, and that it would require things of him that were not small. She understood that he had taken on something on her behalf, and that this was what he had meant when he said it was not her concern to carry. She was still learning what it felt like to have someone else carry a thing she had been carrying alone. It was strange. Not uncomfortable, but strange. Like using a muscle that had been unused for a long time, and finding that it still worked. She went back to work. Gerald Voss arrived at Blackstone Manor on a Wednesday afternoon, in a black car, with 2 men. Owen saw the vehicle on the estate camera feed at 20 minutes to 2. He had the registration confirmed in under a minute, and was at the study door, knocking once and opening it without waiting for the word. Dominic had expected this. Not this specific day or hour, but the general shape of it had been clear from the morning after the dinner, from the moment he had properly understood what Fletcher's presence in the Callaway delegation meant. A man like Gerald Voss did not send a tracker into another PAC's territory to gather information, and then do nothing with that information. He sent a tracker so that he could act on what came back. When the information came back, Gerald acted. The 4 days between the dinner and this Wednesday afternoon had been preparation. He had spoken to his solicitor on Monday, going through the relevant provisions of inter-PAC law governing PAC membership, forced markings, incomplete bond ceremonies, and the conditions under which a claim of formal PAC membership could be considered legally valid. He had read the relevant sections himself afterward, and confirmed in his own understanding what the solicitor had told him. He had spoken to Caleb and Grant and 2 other senior members of the enforcement arm, giving each of them their positions and their instructions for the specific scenario he had described, without giving them more than they needed to know. He had spoken to Owen fully. He had not spoken to Lena. He had seen her in the house in the days since the kitchen conversation, and she had been, in every outward way, exactly what she had always been: contained, professional, quiet. But the quality of it had shifted slightly. One specific layer of the careful management of distance she had always maintained had been quietly and deliberately removed. She moved through the house the same way she always had, but something in the texture of her presence was different, and he was aware of it, in the specific way his wolf had been aware of her from the beginning. He stood up when Owen came through the door. "Tell them they may enter the forecourt," he said. "Tell them to wait at the inner gate." He put his jacket on and went downstairs. He crossed the forecourt at his own pace. Caleb and Grant were already moving into their positions as he came out the front door, placed with the specific precision of people who had been briefed and who knew exactly what their assignment was. Owen came through the side door and fell into place at Dominic's left. The black car came through the outer gate and stopped in the forecourt. Gerald Voss stepped out first. He was in his late 40s, broad and well-dressed, with the composed ease of a man who had been making strategic first impressions for decades, and had refined the practice to the point where it operated without effort. His face was even. His eyes, at this distance, were doing what they were usually doing in situations like this, appearing warmer than they actually were. He looked at the group at the inner gate. He made the calculation that the sight of it required Dominic at the center, Owen to the left, Caleb and Grant behind and apart. He made it quickly and without visible reaction. Then he walked forward. "Alpha Blackstone," he said, with the slight inclination of the head, appropriate for an alpha on another alpha's territory. "Thank you for receiving me on short notice." "You were in the area," Dominic said. Gerald absorbed this without visible response. "I apologize for the informality," he said. "This is a matter I felt warranted a personal conversation, rather than the delays of the formal process." "Then tell me the matter," Dominic said. Gerald reached into his coat and produced a folder, thick and dark-backed. He held it out toward Dominic with the ease of someone presenting the obvious. "A member of your household staff is a formally registered member of the Voss PAC, who was placed through a staffing agency outside of PAC territory, without authorization from the PAC. This is a violation of the Interpack framework governing the movement of registered members across territorial boundaries. He kept his voice smooth and reasonable, the voice of someone explaining something that he expected to be agreed with. The documentation is all here. I have no desire to create complications for your household. This is simply a matter of correcting a placement error. Dominic took the folder. He opened it. He looked at the first page for 5 seconds. He closed the folder. He held it back toward Gerald. The documentation rests on a false premise, he said. His voice was level and without heat, the voice of someone who has concluded something before a conversation begins and is now communicating that conclusion. The marking ceremony, which is the mechanism through which formal pack membership is established in the Voss pack, was not completed. It was initiated and it failed. An incomplete ceremony produces no lawful bond and no formal membership. She is not a registered member of the Voss pack. She is not subject to the provisions you have cited. She is not pack property under any framework this territory recognizes. Gerald's expression remained composed. His eyes did something slightly different. The failure of the ceremony was anomalous, he said, his voice still smooth. The intent was clearly established and documented. The initiation was witnessed. There are interpretive provisions within the broader Interpack framework that— There are no provisions, Dominic said, that create a lawful bond from an incomplete ceremony. He said incomplete once, quietly. Finally, Gerald looked at him. He looked at Owen. He looked at Caleb and Grant. He looked at the inner gate and the closed forecourt behind Dominic, and whatever calculation he was running behind his composed face arrived at its conclusion. He tried one more approach. She is on your property, under circumstances that were not disclosed to you at the time of her placement, he said. I would think any alpha would want to know the full picture of who is on his land. I have the full picture, Dominic said. Gerald waited a beat. She is employed on this property, Dominic said. While she is on this property, she is within Blackstone Pack territory, and every person within this territory is under this pack's protection. That is not conditional. It does not require her to have disclosed everything about her history to anyone. It simply means she is here, and this is my territory, and the protection applies. He looked at Gerald directly. You came to collect someone who is not yours to collect. That conversation is now finished. The forecourt was very quiet. Gerald Voss looked at Dominic Blackstone, and Dominic did not move, and did not change his expression, and did not do anything, except stand at the inner gate, with the specific, settled quality of a man on his own territory, who has stopped negotiating. There is a specific kind of silence that happens between two alphas when one of them simply stops. It was not aggressive, and it was not dramatic. It was just the quality of a thing that was finished, communicated through the specific combination of position and stillness, and the absolute absence of any signal that further conversation was welcome. Gerald had produced this quality himself many times. He recognized it completely. He said, very quietly, "This conversation is not finished." "Drive safely," Dominic said. Gerald held his eyes for one additional beat. Then he turned. He said something brief and low to the two men behind him. They walked back to the car. Gerald got in last, with the pause at the door of someone who wants to make sure the exit is observed. The door closed. The car turned in the forecourt and went back through the outer gate. Owen let out a slow, controlled breath beside Dominic. Caleb looked at Dominic. Dominic nodded once. Both enforcers relaxed their positions. Dominic turned and walked back toward the manor. He pushed open the side door and stepped into the east corridor. Lena was at the east-facing window. She had been there for most of the conversation. She was very still, her hands at her sides, and her face was doing something it did not usually do. Something was moving through her composure from underneath it, pressing at the edges, not quite held back. Her eyes were very bright. He looked at her. She looked at him. He did not explain or summarize. She had heard everything she needed to hear. He looked at her for a moment, and then walked past her and went upstairs to his study. He sat at his desk. He thought through what came next, because Gerald's statement that the conversation was not finished was not empty, and preparing for the continuation of it was the next thing that needed doing. He thought through the probable shapes of the next approach, and what each would require. He picked up his pen. He got to work. In the east corridor, Lena stood at the window for a little while longer after Dominic had gone. The forecourt below was empty. The outer gate had closed. The black car was gone. The gravel was undisturbed, as though nothing that had just happened in front of it had left any physical mark on the world. She breathed. What she had heard was this. Dominic Blackstone had stood at the gate of his own property, with his beta at his left and his enforcers behind him, and had looked Gerald Voss in the eye and told him, in completely clear and final terms, that the claim was not valid and she was not going with him. He had done it without heat. He had done it without performance. He had looked Gerald directly in the eye and stated, as a simple and settled fact, that she was on his territory and under his protection, and the conversation was finished. And Gerald had left. She stood in the corridor and let this be true for a moment. She had spent 10 months carrying the specific weight of being a person who, if found, would be collected and returned like a misplaced object. She had organized her entire existence around the single fact that found meant gone, that found meant back to the Voss Pack compound, and to whatever Gerald had decided would happen to an Omega who had walked out through his boundary and stayed gone for almost a year. She had believed, in the most honest part of herself, that there was no force available to her that was stronger than Gerald's right to collect her. She had believed this, not because she had examined the belief and found it true, but because she had never had the opportunity to examine it against any alternative. She had been on her own, one person, alone, moving through the world at the edges of things, trying to stay unseen. A right of collection, even if it was a false one, was more than she had. She had not believed, until approximately 40 minutes ago, that anyone would stand between her and that. She breathed again. The brightness in her eyes did not resolve into anything more dramatic than brightness. She was not a person who cried easily. That had gone somewhere in the first months of movement, replaced by a very effective dam that she had been grateful for many times since. But the brightness was there, pressing at the backs of her eyes, and she let it be there for the moment she was standing alone, in the east corridor, with no one to maintain her face for. Then, she pressed her palms flat against the wall beside the window, and looked at the empty forecourt, and thought, very carefully, about what had just happened, and what it meant. Gerald had said the conversation was not finished. She had heard this. She had also heard Dominic say, "Drive safely," in the tone of someone who had already made peace with the continuation, and was not concerned about it. She trusted this tone, in the way she had found herself, over the past several days, increasingly trusting his assessments. He did not overstate, he did not understate, he said what was true. She thought about what the continuation would look like. She thought about what Gerald would do next, and what options were available to him, and what this pack's response to each of those options would likely be. She thought about all of this carefully, standing at the window in the east corridor. Then she went back to work. She had tasks remaining for the afternoon. She completed all of them, correctly and in order, with the methodical care she brought to everything that mattered. Clara reviewed her work at 4 and gave her the nod. She ate dinner with Nina and Beth, and listened to Nina describe the book she was now quite sure she liked. And she contributed 2 useful comments to the conversation, and she helped wash the dishes and said goodnight. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at the bag on the floor. She looked at it for a long time. Then she bent down and unzipped it, and took out the items that she had packed in the night 3 days ago. She put them back in the dresser drawers and on the hook behind the door and on the small shelf by the desk. She folded the bag and put it in the bottom drawer of the dresser, where it had been before she had packed it in the dark. She closed the drawer. She sat back on the edge of the bed. She looked at the window and the dark garden wall beyond it. She had decided. She did not examine the decision too closely. Examining decisions after they were made was sometimes necessary but usually not. She had made it, and it was the right one, and the evidence for it was everything that had happened today. She lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling, and let herself, in the privacy of her own room in the dark, feel a thing she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Something that, if she was being honest, was the beginning of hope. He found her in the garden after dinner, and it had the specific quality of something that had not been arranged so much as arrived at through a series of small individual decisions that collectively pointed in one direction. He had finished at his desk at 7. He had eaten the meal on his desk tray without tasting it in any particular way, which was ordinary. He had sat for another 20 minutes staring at the document he needed to review without reading it, which was less ordinary. At some point he had put his jacket on, and walked downstairs and out the back door, and had found, on the stone path between the back entrance and the garden wall, that he had a direction, and it was the bench near the far wall where the old roses grew. She was already there. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, and her face turned slightly upward toward the sky above the garden wall, which was fully dark now in the October evening, the first stars becoming visible in the gaps between the last thin clouds. The climbing roses along the far wall were past their season, dark and dense and leafy still in rust and deep red against the pale stone. The stone bench was cold. She had a light jacket over her uniform. She heard his footsteps on the gravel and turned her head. She looked at him without surprise, without guardedness. The composure was there, as it always was, but one layer beneath it had been removed in a way that was new, that had something to do with today and what had happened in front of the gate. She looked like a person who had set down something very heavy and had not yet fully processed the physical relief of no longer carrying it. He walked to the bench and sat beside her. He sat with perhaps 18 inches between them, which was not arranged and not deliberate, just the natural spacing of two people sitting together for the first time, without any prior agreement about what the geometry of it should be. Neither of them said anything for a while. The garden in October was very quiet, the specific quiet of a season completing itself, not the alive humming quiet of summer, but the still, clear, settled quiet of things moving into their winter state. The light from the manor's back windows reached halfway across the lawn and then fell away into the darker air. The pines at the far boundary moved very slightly in a wind that was barely more than a suggestion. Above the wall, the stars were growing more numerous and more bright as the last of the evening light faded. He had been thinking, since late afternoon, about what this moment required of him. He had been building toward it for longer than that. He had been building toward it since the kitchen conversation 4 days ago, since the moment she had sat at the table and told him everything she had been carrying alone, since he had listened and understood what honesty had cost her, and what honesty in return was therefore required of him. He had been moving around the edges of it for days, identifying what needed to be said, and finding one reason, and then another, to wait a little longer. He had run out of reasons. He said, into the garden. Her name was Diane. Lena was still. She was looking at the roses on the wall. I met her when I was 26, he said. I had been leading this pack for 3 years. I had the practical elements of it, the structure, the authority, the mechanics of running a territory. What I was still learning was the deeper thing, what it required of you that no briefing or training covered, what it asked of the parts of you that the pack never saw. She was very clear-eyed about that. She had a way of seeing which things I was working around rather than addressing, and of waiting, with complete patience, and without any judgment about the waiting, until I caught up to what she had already understood. He paused. She also had a specific kind of humor. Very quiet. The kind that lived in a single word, or in the way she looked at something, or in a pause that was more specific than words would have been. You had to be paying full attention to catch it. I learned to pay full attention. He looked at his hands on his knees. She died 3 years ago, he said. No illness, no warning. She was in the world, and then she was not. And everything I had organized my understanding of my own life around, at a level so fundamental I had not been fully aware of the organizing, because it had simply always been there, became a different shape, an absent shape. He breathed slowly. I spent a long time trying to find language adequate to the fact of it. I did not find language that was adequate. I built a life around the inadequacy instead. Lena had not moved. My wolf went silent, he said. I want to try to describe what this actually means, because I think the words are not widely understood from the outside. The wolf is not separate from the person. It is the deepest and most fundamental layer of what you are, the part that was there first, that operates below the reach of reasoning and decision, and all the careful construction of self that comes later. When it goes silent, it does not disappear. It remains, the way a space remains when everything that was in it has been removed. The shape is the same. The quality of the space is completely different. There is nothing there that answers, nothing that responds. He was quiet for a moment. I organized my life around this silence for 3 years. The schedule, the work, the structure of this household, all of it built to function in that specific absence. I became very good at the functioning. I told myself on most days that it was a sufficient life. He looked at the roses on the wall. 3 weeks ago, On a Tuesday evening, I came back from a run through the side entrance of the manor. I was not paying full attention to where I was going. I pushed open the door to the linen storage room in the east corridor. He paused. You were inside. Your back was to the door. I closed it immediately. Before you could have heard it. Before you could have turned around. I want to be completely clear about that. You were not aware of it. You had no experience of being seen. Lena was very still beside him. In the 2 seconds I stood in that doorway, he said, my wolf rose. Not gradually. Not in any way I could have prepared for. All the way up, immediately, from 3 years of silence, to complete and total wakefulness in the space of 2 seconds. The way a light goes from nothing to full brightness when the switch is thrown. He looked at the stars above the garden wall, and it said one thing, mine, with the specific certainty of a thing that is not making a claim but stating a fact. The way a compass states north. Not deciding north is correct, simply orienting toward what it has always been built to find. The garden was quiet. He said, I spent the weeks since trying to build a framework that explained this as something other than what it appeared to be. Extended dormancy calibration error. False resonance. I read about it. I had all the language ready. I was not convincing, even to myself. After a long moment, Lena said, what did you do with it? I went to my study and sat in the dark, he said. Then I spent several days going for unnecessarily long runs and staring at the territory map. Then I carried it, because carrying things is something I know how to do. She looked at the garden wall. He thought, from the corner of his vision, that the corner of her mouth moved very slightly. I am not telling you this as a claim, he said. I want to be absolutely clear about that. What my wolf knows is not a requirement it places on you. You are employed here, and you are protected here, and both of those things are true, regardless of what you feel, or decide, or do not feel, or do not decide. I am telling you because you were honest with me, and honesty in return was the only adequate response to that. I am telling you because the not telling had become, increasingly, the wrong kind of silence. Lena looked at her hands in her lap. After a moment, she said, for the past year, I have been living inside a single day at a time. Not by choice. It was the only way to keep functioning, without spending all my energy on a future I could not reliably access. I stopped letting myself think more than a day or two ahead. I stopped wanting things that were more than a day or two away. She was quiet for a moment. I had forgotten what it felt like to be somewhere and let myself think. I might still be here next month. I might still be here in 3 months. I had forgotten what it felt like to be somewhere that felt like a somewhere. He listened. Today, she said, when you came back inside after Gerald left, when I was standing in the corridor and I heard what you had said to him, I felt something I had almost stopped believing I was capable of feeling. She looked at the roses on the wall. Safe. Not all right for right now. Not okay for this moment. Actually safe. The word meant something real. I was in the condition it was describing. She was quiet. I had very nearly stopped believing that was possible for me. The owl, somewhere beyond the wall, called once, precisely, in the October dark, and was not answered. She sat quietly for a little while. Then she reached across the small distance between them on the bench and placed her hand on top of his. His wolf exhaled. Not dramatically. Not with anything large or urgent or overwhelming. With the profound and simple completeness of something that has been held under tension for 3 years and is suddenly, fully, without ceremony, released from that tension. The hollow place inside him, that specific, particular empty quality that he had organized 3 years of his life around and had accepted as a permanent condition of his existence, changed. It did not fill with noise. It filled with something steady and present and exactly right. The specific quality of something returning to the place it had always belonged. He looked down at their joined hands. He did not move. He did not speak. He sat completely still on the bench in the October garden, with the light from the manor falling partway across the lawn, and the old roses dark and dense on the garden wall, and his wolf finally at rest, in the right way. Not the rest of absence, the rest of arrival. She did not move either. They sat together in the garden, and the stars were bright and cold above the wall, and the manor breathed in its old, patient way behind them, and the pines moved very slightly at the far boundary. He had built a life around the shape of a loss. He had done it carefully and intelligently, and with the clear-eyed acceptance of a man who had understood that some things cannot be changed and have to be lived around instead. He had lived around it for 3 years, and he had done it well, and it had cost him something he had not fully let himself measure. He was sitting in a garden in October, with her hand warm on top of his and his wolf at rest for the first time in 3 years, and he understood something that all his years of careful organization had not been able to tell him. There was a very large difference between a life organized around what was missing and a life that had found what was missing. He had been the first kind for a long time. He was, in this moment, becoming the second kind. He did not know yet what the shape of it would be. There was still Gerald Voss, and the conversation that was not finished, and there was still Lena's history, and what she needed, and the pace she needed to move at, and there was still much that was uncertain and not settled. These were real things that would require real attention, but the wolf was at rest, and she was here, and her hand was on top of his. He looked at the stars above the garden wall. He looked at the roses, dark and dense and still, holding their late color against the pale stone. He looked at their joined hands in the fading light. Something in him that had been cold and locked and silent for 3 long years, simply, quietly, without fanfare or ceremony, let go. The October air was cold and clean around them, carrying the smell of resin and turned earth, and the specific quality of the north that Lena had noticed on the first evening she walked up the path from the gate. Old, patient, entirely itself. They sat together in the quiet. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything that the moment needed to be, and everything that both of them had been moving toward, without knowing they were moving toward it, and it was exactly what it was. 2 people, each of them carrying things they had carried alone for a long time, sitting together in a garden at the end of an October day, not yet knowing what came next, simply present in what was now. Which was enough. Which was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly enough.